Judiciary Committee will come to order. And our first item of business is to open the hearing on House Bill 2698, allowing juvenile offenders in the custody of the Secretary of Corrections to leave the juvenile correction facility for certain programming and educational opportunities when approved by the Secretary. And with that, then, we will have a bill brief from the reviser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Committee. Jason Thompson, Office of Reviser of Statutes. You have the bill brief in your packet, I hope. This is the bill, as the Chair said, that allows juvenile offenders in the custody of the Secretary to leave the correctional facility for certain programming and educational opportunities. Procedurally, the bill was requested by Jennifer King on behalf of the Department of Corrections. It was heard and worked by the Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice in the House side. Passed the House 120-0 on final action, and now finds its way to you. The bill amends one section, KSA 75-7062. That's the statute that gives the Secretary of Corrections all powers and duties related to juvenile correctional facilities. We note that current law in subsection D prohibits the Secretary from issuing a pass, furlough, or leave to a juvenile placed in a facility unless needed for such juvenile to obtain medical services or to reintegrate into the community. If the juvenile is issued a pass, furlough, or leave, the juvenile is required to be accompanied by a staff member or other designated adult. So that's the current state of the law there at the bottom of the first page of the bill. The bill would authorize the Secretary to allow a juvenile to leave the facility for employment, job interviews, education, job training, or skills development classes or programs, treatment programs, or any community pro-social activity to support risk reduction and reintegration. That's at the bottom of the first page there, the new italic language. The juvenile could be allowed to leave the facility without being accompanied by a staff member. And the bill does require the Secretary to adopt policies and procedures to ensure adequate oversight, supervision, and accountability of the juveniles that are allowed to leave the facility. The last thing I note is that it would take effect on publication in the statute book, which would be July 1st of this year. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Committee questions? Not seeing any. Then we will invite the proponent, Megan Milner, Deputy Secretary of Juvenile and Adult Community-Based Services, Kansas Department of Corrections. Please introduce yourself and welcome to committee.
Good morning, Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee. I am Megan Milner, and I am the Deputy Secretary of Juvenile and Adult Community-Based Services for the Kansas Department of Corrections. I'm pleased to be here today to present testimony in support of House Bill 2698. The Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex is the state's only juvenile correctional facility and serves both male and female youth who are adjudicated by the court as juvenile offenders and sentenced to a determined amount of time at the facility. Over the years, KJCC has worked very hard to be responsive to research and evidence that shows what works with the justice-involved population, the juvenile population. And I do outline some of those things in my written testimony, which I'm more than happy to elaborate on if you would like for me to. But this House bill really takes another step in allowing the juvenile correctional facility in Kansas to be able to support youth as they prepare for reintegration back into the community, specifically in those areas of education and employment and other areas that would help reduce their risk to reoffend. The one thing I will point out from my written testimony is as of January 31st, 2024, there were 141 youth who were at KJCC. That's when I pulled the data. 12 of them were females, so a big difference between the male and female population. But what I really want to point out is that 100% of the youth were 15 years old or older. So just about every single youth who is releasing from the juvenile correctional facility is eligible to enter the workforce. or to move on to post-secondary education when they leave the juvenile correctional facility. And this bill would help the correctional facility in continuing to prepare those youth for reentry back into the community by providing important vocational and employment-related skills and training, as well as connection to continuing education in the community. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I am happy to stand for questions.
Thank you. Are there other proponent conferees wishing to testify? Not seeing any, so we'll go ahead and open it up for any questions. Do we have any questions? Yes, Senator Gossage.
Hi, thank you for being here. I think one of the things that troubled me that said they would be allowed to leave the facility without being accompanied by a staff member. Could you address that?
Madam Chairwoman, committee members, Senator, thank you for asking the question. This would be similar to what we see at some of the adult facilities with work release. So likely the way this would work out, we still have some details that we would need to work out regarding what this would look like, but staff members would escort the individual to that location, but would not necessarily be there in person with them the whole time. So for instance, if a young man or young woman were going to attend a class at the Washburn Institute of Technology, staff would transport, but may not or likely would not sit in on the class to supervise that individual during that class. So we would transport to and from, and but they would not necessarily be in that class, similar to what we see with work release.
So they would be accompanied. They just not would stay with the individual.
Correct, yes,
So
ma'am.
maybe it's just in the wording then.
Yes, that it could be, yes.
And then a final question, if I may, Madam Chair, is that the way also the wording stated is other social activities. So I hear you talking about work, which is great, helping them get into the workforce and talking about educational purposes. But could you explain what are some of the other parameters that maybe were not educational or job related?
Madam Chair, Senator, thank you. I believe the wording in the statute is other pro-social activities. So we're not necessarily talking about a social activity like getting together with friends or family members. It would be when we reference a pro-social activity, we are referencing an activity that reinforces those characteristics or skills that are needed in order for an individual to discontinue criminal behavior. So it would be connecting them to, it could be a treatment provider. I believe that's allowed in the statute. It could be an employer to connect them with that type of pro-social activity, meaning it is positive and it's reinforcing those positive skills that that individual needs in order to not go out and commit more crime.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Stephan.
Thank you. Can you help me understand the evaluation process that you undertake with the individual juvenile offender before they qualify to do this?
Madam Chair, Senator, so some of those details still have to be worked out. Some of the things that we would consider would include the nature of the offense, their county of conviction, maybe even the likelihood that they might come in contact with a victim. That would absolutely need to be considered in this process, but also their conduct at the facility. Have they complied with their case plan and have they completed necessary programs and treatment at the facility? And now they're getting closer to release and need some of these skills.
Thank you. And do you have other questions, Senator Stephan?
I'd
Okay.
follow up real quick. Thank you.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, this is clearly an expansion of what you've been doing. Your success rate of getting these kids back into a normal environment, you've been wildly successful, I take it?
Madam Chair, Senator, I don't have our recidivism numbers right here with me, but I can get those for you, um, and provide those to you if that would be okay.
Thank you. Senator Baumgardner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when we're talking about this, the juvenile going to a facility for additional education, have you narrowed it down that it is specifically going to be Washburn Tech? Or, well, why don't you just expand on that first?
Madam Chair, Senator, was used as an example because we have a current established partnership with them. It does not mean that we would not expand to other opportunities that might be available for youth, depending upon their needs or their interests in what they want to do when they leave the facility. Our priority really would be helping these youth identify a career path if that's appropriate for them, and then helping them set out those goals and those steps that they need to achieve that. Some of that might include Washburn Institute of Technology. We have a young man who's at the facility right now. He doesn't release for a while, but he recently achieved a 29 on his ACT. An incredibly intelligent young man has already been accepted to Washburn University. And so this would be an opportunity that we might be able to afford him to start those classes, and still have the support and the structure of the facility as he's beginning a college education. So that is sort of an example, but I would imagine that we would be expanding to and looking for a lot of different resources to connect these youth to. Washburn Institute of Technology was just one example.
Well, I know that you have virtual welding there that's being offered to students, and that's through SB 155, and that Washburn Tech is offering the credits for that. But I guess I'm curious because it's one thing when the instructor is there at the juvenile facility. So what is the communication and the background information that would be provided with an instructor in a public or private institution that's providing instructional services to let them know that you do have an individual that in the evening, morning, and afternoon would be incarcerated? So what information are you giving? Is the plan to give that instructor?
Madam Chair, Senator, some of that information would be limited because we're working with justice-involved youth, and some of their information is more protected. But there would certainly need to be some communication with that institution or the employer that would make the proper notifications. We have not had those conversations yet with those individuals or those institutions, just being unsure if this would pass.
I appreciate that, Madam Chair. I will tell you, having been an instructor at the college level, an instructor has the right to know because they're going to team students up oftentimes for activities and projects. And if all you're going to do is allow one individual in admissions to know about it, I don't think that's sufficient. So I think that that is something that really needs to be meted out further. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And some of the questions today sound like policy decisions rather than policies and procedures to be enacted by the secretary through rules and regulations. So it seems pretty wide open right now, and without more policy in place to be brought before this legislative body raises some concerns. I understand the intent of the bill. Let me ask, this is, you've said, similar to work release. However, work release has involved and does involve adults. These are juveniles. What kind of liability protection is there for the employer, for the educational institution, for the business who's hosting a pro-social activity, that if, first of all, the juvenile offender, they're a child, if they leave the facility, if they are injured at the facility, if they injure another participant at the facility or the institution. Does workers' compensation apply, or would that be on the state because they're in state custody? So these are kind of questions that maybe you don't have answers for, but perhaps should be considered policy and not rules and regulations by the secretary. So do you have any comment?
Madam Chair, you're correct. I don't have answers for all of that today. We would have to work out some of those details with employers as far as that liability. I won't say that there is not a measure of risk that's associated with doing something like this and allowing residents at the facility to leave. I do believe that the benefit that this proposes for juveniles as they are reintegrating is substantial. And but I will not stand up here and say that there is not a risk.
Sure, and I understand, the purpose behind it and the intent, but we also have an obligation to those others who are at the facility, either learning or recreating or whatever the purpose of the facility is, and to keep that juvenile safe as well. And let me ask one other question, and before we entertain others, why the difference in allowing a juvenile to be released for these reasons, but has to be currently in law accompanied by a staff member or other designated adult for release for medical services?
Madam Chair, that would be for like a medical appointment. They would have to be accompanied for the medical, for that medical purpose. I can tell you that in my time with the department, a leave for medical purposes, I can't recall a time that has ever occurred.
And currently, juvenile can be released with a staff member or other designated adult to reintegrate such juvenile into the community. That's current law there on line 28 of page 1 of the bill. But this would expand, as we heard, the opportunity for the juvenile and wouldn't require consistent accompaniment by a staff member or other designated adult, because you'd have the instructor, you'd have the you'd have somebody's got to be designated as keeping an eye on the juvenile, and I assume that's things that would be worked out in rules and regulation, but as I have said, maybe should be policy to be considered by the legislature. With that, Senator Baumgardner, did you have other questions?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things that we do know is that an individual that's incarcerated, regardless of age, is more likely to not fall into recidivism if they have a skill, if they have certification or degree, and see that they have a future for themselves to earn a living wage. So it's fairly vague as far as programs, but high need, high demand programs would be preferable. And I guess what I do wonder is that I don't think I've heard is what are other states doing with regard to juveniles? Is some of the language concerns that it seem to be absent so far, can those be found codified by other states as far as what they're doing to help those teenagers that are about to get out of incarceration to get something from a career tech standpoint, or even that matriculation into a gen ed and a different type of degree program? Are you aware of other programs in neighboring states?
Madam Chair, Senator, I don't have a listing of those programs. We could certainly collaborate with my peers across the country to find those. I have had some contact with some of them, and I do know that there are other facilities in the country who are providing these types of work release or reintegration type services for youth. But I can formulate a better list of that and get it to you with some examples of those. One of the things I would mention is we do have a current partnership with the Washburn Institute of Technology, and we're able to offer, I believe it's about 4 different certification programs for youth. So if a youth is interested in one of those 4, we have the ability to connect them to that. This may open up that opportunity to connect them to more.
I think it would be helpful. I'm sensing that we are going to want some language amendments that could be made. So it's less for information, but it's more if you can find perhaps what is in language in other states. That would be helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, committee. Any other questions? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for your testimony. Committee, I will also direct your attention to proponent written only testimony from Laura Blake Boers, Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee. Are there any who wish to testify as neutral or opponents on House Bill 2698? Not seeing any, then we will close the hearing on House Bill 2698 and open the hearing on House Bill 2490, providing that each juvenile offender case length limit extension shall be for not longer than 90 days. With that, a bill brief from the reviser.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson, Revisor's Office. As you mentioned, this is a bill concerning juvenile offender case length limit extensions. Procedurally, it was requested in the House on behalf of the Russ Jennings Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight that some of you are members of. It went through the Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice and passed the House on final action 120-0 before being referred here. As I mentioned in the bill brief, and most of you will recall this from last year, in 2023, the legislature amended this statute, KSA 38-2391, to allow extensions of the overall case length limit in juvenile offender cases when a juvenile has failed to complete a court-ordered program, and that's due to repeated intentional effort to delay by the juvenile, as long as it's not due to repeated intentional effort to delay. So the amendment in this bill does not undo that change. You'll find that on page 2 in line 28. The extensions are granted incrementally, that's current law, and what's added in the bill is that those incremental extensions shall not exceed 90 days per extension. So the Joint Committee was presented with testimony dealing with what did it mean for extensions of probation to be granted incrementally, and the Joint Committee defined that to mean 90-day incremental extensions. And that's the bill that's in front of you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Not seeing any. We will invite the proponent conferee, Kevin Waring, Kansas Association of Court Services Office, who's appearing on WebEx today. Please introduce yourself and welcome to committee.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair
please-
Warren.
I'm going to go ahead and ask you to all of our conferees to limit your testimony to 4 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair Warren and committee members for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Kevin Waring. I am the Chief Court Services Officer in the 10th Judicial District. Today, I am appearing as the Legislative Chair for the Kansas Association of Court Services Officers. Our association, CACSO, is supportive of House Bill 2490. CACSO was supportive during the last legislative session in 2023 regarding the bill that created the ability for juvenile probation cases to be extended on their case length limit. Now, House Bill 2490 would provide additional clarification and guidance on that language regarding incremental extensions. It would cap any extension at 90 days. CACSO believes this change still allows the court the ability to ensure successful juvenile supervision, which was the focus of our testimony and support last year, while not keeping youth on supervision any longer than necessary. So again, we have also provided our written testimony to the committee in support of House Bill 2490. We hope the committee considers the bill favorably. Again, I thank you for your time this morning, and I'm happy to answer any questions Madam Chair or the committee may have.
Thank you. Committee, I'll ask actually, are there any other proponent conferees wishing to testify today? Not seeing any. Committee then want to direct your attention. We have proponent written only testimony from Laura Blake Boers, Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee. And with that, then we will open it up for any questions for the proponent conferee. I have a quick question for the reviser. Could you remind the committee what the bill from 2023 was? Just the number.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I wrote it down right in the bill brief, which I hope I did, it's 2023 House Bill 2021.
Thank you. Committee, any questions for the proponent? Not seeing any, then thank you very much for your testimony today. We will then hear from neutral conferee Mike Fonkert, Deputy Director, Kansas Appleseed Center for Law and Justice on WebEx. Please introduce yourself and welcome to committee. 4 minutes, please.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Mike Fonkert. I am the Deputy Director at Kansas Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, and I'm here today to provide neutral testimony on House Bill 2490. As was just discussed, this bill aims to clarify a change that was made in House Bill 2021 last year that allowed for incremental case length extensions, but did not define those increments. We know that research shows that the time on probation or the time that youth are involved in the justice system does not always equal better outcomes for children. And one research study has pointed out that prolonging the probation period of justice-involved youth perpetuates a continuous cycle of involvement in the justice system. And this is particularly harmful to young people because of the vulnerable developmental stage they are in with regards to rational decision-making and behavioral regulation. Results show that the longer a child is interacting with the justice system and on prolonged probation, the greater risk for poor outcomes. And studies have also shown that the inverse is true, with a decrease in recidivism happening when a child successfully completes a set of probation and support programs in a timely fashion. The research is clear. The best way to ensure success for justice-involved youth is to reduce the time that they interact with the system in total and provide meaningful programs and community supports while they are involved with it. Given this research, we would urge the committee to consider reducing the amount of the incremental extension to 30 days or at most 60 days. A 30-day incremental extension would reduce the continued life and developmental interruptions to a young person in their family, and would also ensure that a young person struggling to complete requirements would not fall through the cracks with a 3-month extension. 30 days instead would mean any barriers or challenges that the young person is experiencing would be quickly identified and necessary supports for successful completion could be put into place. We support this 30-day incremental extension idea because it would more better align Kansas practices with research-supported best practices. Best practices show that policies should limit the circumstances that probation terms can be extended. Probation should only be extended to allow the young person time to complete an evidence-based program or their risk and needs assessment. We would argue that the 90-day extension is not an appropriate extension length given the parameters of the research-based best practices. So essentially, we're working with a population of kids that have been identified as struggling to complete their programs. And rather than a quarterly extension, which in the life of a child, 3 months is a lot. I mean, you look at the length of the average school semester. And so since we have identified these kids as needing extra supports, we believe it makes sense to reduce that extension length as much as possible. Like I said, 30 days, 60 days at most, to make sure that we're checking back on the progress identifying whatever barriers that child is encountering and dealing with those appropriately so that we can get that kid completed with any programming and be able to have them exit probation and ideally exit any sort of system involvement. So that is our suggestion, and we would urge the committee to consider amending this bill to reduce that 90-day timeline. And with that, I thank you all for your time and would be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you. Are there other persons wishing to testify as neutral? Not seeing any, then we'll open it up for any questions for the conferee. Senator Baumgardner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This could be for either proponent or neutral. Is there any indication that any type of literacy assessment is done on these individuals that fail to complete any of the programs due to repeated intentional effort to delay by the juvenile? So is there any type of literacy assessment that's done on the juvenile?
We don't generally go back to prior conferees in the category that's we've heard from already, so we'll ask our neutral conferee.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator, for the question. I am not aware of any literacy assessments that are done. Unfortunately, I think this might be a better question for Mr. Waring, but I am not aware that that's a process that's done, and I think that's a valid concern, as we know a lot of our young people in justice-involved situations are behind educationally.
Madam Chair, the reason I asked that is simply because of what was provided in the neutral testimony about missing. When you're talking about 90 days, that's most of a school semester. But the other thing that we do know, for the districts that have really been working on literacy, particularly addressing literacy issues of tween age, so middle school kids, as well as those that are entering in high school, they're seeing a significant reduction in the type of behavior that would get a teenager or a tween into a juvenile situation with regard to corrections. So it seems to me that while we're addressing the issue of the 90 days, we should also perhaps include that there does need to be an evaluation with regard to the literacy. We know that nationally, and this bears out for our state as well, for adults that are in corrections, 9 out of 10 of them are illiterate. And so acting out is a means of avoiding school altogether. It would also be a means of avoiding any type of program that is required by the courts. So I think that would be something that I'll be working on in an amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. This is a question for research or for the revisor. Do we have any information from the hearing on the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee that would be responsive to the question? Or we could be, looks like we'll be getting an amendment about that issue for some evaluation for literacy. Committee, we have next questions from Senator Haley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This was along the line of what I was asking, so wanted to ask. So actually, my inquiry has been addressed.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for the neutral conferee? Not seeing any, then thank you for your testimony today. And we will hear from opponent conferee Nicholas Reinecker, private citizen. Please introduce yourself and welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee, for allowing me to speak today. My name is Nicholas Reinecker from Inman, Kansas. I'm an opponent to House Bill 2490. And I don't want to step on any toes, but as I understand it, in my private citizen capacity, after Senate Bill 367, we had the language in Section 1 that the period, lines 14 through 16, saying that the period of time ordered by the court shall not be extended as far as the overall case limit. And then in 2020, or House Bill substitute for House Bill 2021, which I testified on. We kind of did an about face, and now we're doing that, if that's the committee's proposal. But everybody knows why I come up here. So my scenarios is if a 20-year-old man in Kansas is caught by law enforcement with tobacco, he could be charged with a tobacco infraction and fined $25. But if a juvenile is caught by law enforcement with a small amount of cannabis, he or she could be adjudicated for a Class B misdemeanor. This is illogical in both respects, in my opinion. This juvenile not wanting to go to juvenile detention for rebellious reasons or due to coercive nudging by those around ends up going the treatment route. And during the case length, the juvenile, not seeing an avenue for heart change, decides to possess and consume cannabis again. To my understanding, if this juvenile is not able to pass a urine test for cannabis metabolites or complete programming, whether it's culturally appropriate or not, his case length could be indefinitely extended regardless of incrementalism or caps. So is this how we want to define justice? Now, as a parent, I'm not advocating unrestricted cannabis use by juveniles. However, we should do everything we can to not have a juvenile's life micromanaged and marginalized by government burden and overreach, quasi-chemical restraint, and an endless monthly payment plan that may or may not use my tax money. I'm against extending case length limits. I'm against criminalizing this specific sort of behavior. And there's other issues to think about. We don't test for caffeine or sugar, nor prohibit phone usage on probation. But considering issues like children in need of care and foster care issues, maybe there is an argument for such, just for consistency's sake, regardless of safety and harm. But I don't think we should remove children from their homes for caffeine or sugar use, abuse, or dependence, nor put caffeine or sugar on the Controlled Substances Act either. Finally, Madam Chair, growing up, I was told the purpose of constitutional republic government was to defend individuals' natural rights, restrain evildoers, and foster an environment for private economic growth. The use of force, prosecution, detainment, arrest, civil asset forfeiture, probation, and jail time for violations of the Controlled Substances Act is condoned by this legislature, as well as by myself, when the substances involved are synthetic or biosynthetic and not naturally occurring. Furthermore, I believe in that support that a hard-on-crime approach, even including minimum mandatory sentences, is better than a cycle of don't do it again or you'll be locked up if you don't get treatment attitude, where the use of taxpayer money is being spent on cycles of therapy and risky medication-assisted treatment, which is atypically provided, and where heart change is substituted with temporary behavior change that facilitates cycles of criminality, hopelessness, trauma, and harm. We can do better, and I ask you to please resolve these issues. Thank you, and I will stand for any questions.
Thank you. Are there others wishing to testify in opposition to the bill? Not seeing any, then we will open it up for questions for the opponent conferee. Yes, Senator Haley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not so much a question for Mr. Reinecker, just an observation. I guess maybe there is a question here, come to think of it. I did want to say over the years, I've come to appreciate your addressing what is the innocuous substance or cannabis use and your advocacy ongoing, and I appreciate that. I certainly do, and it makes common sense that we should not be kicking the can down the road with those who test positive, those juveniles, especially for cannabis use, though it remains sadly illegal in our state. So I do appreciate your continued advocacy. However, the question would be, there is really no way without changing the code, which Kansas should have done long ago. I would hope you'd agree regarding cannabis and its possession and use. But there's no way really to address that without changing the code, is there, in this particular bill or what have you? So what could we do if we could do something that would make sense as a legislature regarding cannabis possession and use to make it less invasive or to this bill? This is not really the place to address it. Although your point is well taken. I respect it, I support it, but
Madam Chair, Senator, I don't know if
Make sure we stick to the bill.
technically germane to the bill at hand, but it is my honor and privilege to be able, as a citizen, to come up here and voice my opinion and to have you hear it. And as many of you know, I've come up here for the last 10 years advocating for descheduling cannabis, true decriminalization of cannabis, and allowing the freedom that I think it deserves for the citizenry and individuals of Kansas. So I just ask that you kind of use that information as you filter through the bills, whether it's whatever has to do with juveniles, adults, public health and welfare, or public safety, and let's kind of eliminate some blurred lines between those two. And I thank you for your service to our state.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Not seeing any, then thank you very much for your testimony today. And we will then close the hearing on House Bill 2490. Next, we are going to open the hearing on House Bill 2522, requiring the Secretary of Corrections to prepare inmates for release from custody and assist with gathering identification documentation. With that, a brief from the reviser.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Jason Thompson, Revisor's Office. As you mentioned, House Bill 2522, as amended by House Committee this time, does require the Secretary of Corrections to prepare inmates for release from custody and assist with gathering some identification documents. Procedurally, this one was requested by Representative Owens, who is chair of the Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee on the House side. It went through that committee and then passed the House on final action 12020. The bill creates a new section of law that will require the Secretary within 9 months prior to the release of an inmate to determine whether that inmate has current versions of certain documentation. There's a number of items listed there on the first page of the bill. If the Secretary finds the inmate does not have a copy of their birth certificate or a social security card, the Secretary is required to make a reasonable effort to provide the inmate with that documentation. And if the Secretary finds the inmate does not have other documentation cards, vocational training records, work records, educational certificates or diplomas, or current resume, the Secretary shall provide the inmate with that documentation. The Secretary then is required to coordinate with state agencies as necessary to gather the documents, and all state agencies are required to coordinate with the Secretary to implement the provisions of this section. I note that the new section does not apply to inmates who are going to be released to the custody of another jurisdiction on a warrant or a detainer, and it also does not apply to inmates who are determined by the Secretary to be physically or mentally unable to return to the workforce when released from custody, but all other inmates would be subject to the requirements of the section. The amendment by the House was there on page 1 in lines 23 through 25. The original bill mentioned a certificate of identification that you can use under KSA 8-246 to get your identification when you get released from prison. That's a current law certificate that can be used. And the committee heard and made an amendment to just require issuance of the identification card under KSA 8-1324. So rather than the certificate that allows you to go get an identification, just the identification itself. So I think the conferees might be able to explain that change a little bit better, but essentially that's the only amendment made by the House Committee, is to clarify which form of identification they will help the inmate receive. The rest of the bill is as it was introduced. Be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Committee questions? Not seeing any. Thank you. We will then hear from proponent conferee, Dr. Chris Fanning, Executive Director, Programs and Risk Reduction, Kansas Department of Corrections. Please introduce yourself and welcome to committee.
Madam Chair. I got it. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, for allowing us the opportunity to share with you our current practices and testimony on reentry and release planning in the Department of Corrections. I am Dr. Chris Fanning. I am the Executive Director of Programs and Risk Reduction, and that also includes oversight of reentry and release planning. Our written testimony outlines the key components of reentry and release planning, as well as our ongoing initiatives and challenges we are facing. House Bill 2522 concerns reentry and release planning for KDOC residents. Risk reduction, reentry services, and release planning are provided to all residents consistent with their custody level and areas of risk and need, beginning at 16 months pre-release, or if their time to serve is less than 16 months. The unit team counselor is responsible for developing the reentry plan, and with higher need residents, additional discharge planning services are provided. I would like to note that the counselor does not work in isolation. Effective case management involves entire unit teams, classification administrators, program providers, risk assessors, reentry coordinators, and case management and reentry administrators, to name a few. It is also important to consider the statistics related to returning citizens, which you may have seen in other presentations, but do bear repeating. 95% of our residents will return to the community. 33% of those residents serve less than a year, 47% serve less than 2 years, and 66% serve less than 5 years. Residents serving sentences longer than 5 years are still provided risk reduction and programming. Priority is given to those serving those shorter sentences. Some of the key components the KDOC employs in residents' reentry plans, I'm going to go over a few of these and expand on them. The risk score and profile from the level of surface case management inventory, or the LSCMI, for the males, or the women's risk needs assessment, or WRNA, for females. With our residence plans, there are typically 2 plans created, if not more, the primary plan and then a secondary backup plan. We also look at program history and progress reports. Some of our reentering citizens will need to plan for continuing programs upon release. An example might be an individual who struggles with substance use and needs information about AA or NAA meetings that will be available near their place of residence. We also have residents that are enrolled in college programs who may not have time to complete and will work with the education navigator and our college partner to create a transition plan in order for them to continue their degree. We look at work history, job skills, and plan for employment after release. We look into the status of their identification, including birth certificates, social security card, and a Kansas driver's license or identification card. I will share more information related to our driver's license and ID cards when I discuss our current initiatives. We look at their health profile, physical and mental, any known disabilities and medication, description of their residents' relevant disciplinary history, any known detainers that are pending or unresolved, any known victim issues that may impact the plan, information related to various support systems, family, community resources, any treatment needs, including substance use and sex offenders, and a plan for aftercare. And this is for actual treatment plans, not just programs like AA and NAA. Any pending obligations, restitution, child support, etc., and the plan for payment. We also plan for that transportation upon release. This includes the day they are released, as well as plans for general transportation, especially related to employment and or ongoing aftercare. Finally, we look at those mental health level 4 and medical level 3 and higher, supplemental security income, Medicare and Medicaid, or specialized housing needs that are required. This involves additional discharge planning with additional individuals joining the case management team. This is a unique process that involves not only our facility staff, but also working closely with parole. Some of our current initiatives with reentry and release planning. We are looking at reentry that starts at intake, creating a more efficient process through effective case management. We have a team of directors that conducted a statewide audit of our case management processes last spring, and based on the findings, are working with each facility on a strategic plan to address gaps in services and how we can better meet those needs prior to that 16 months to release. We are looking at developing a statewide catalog of community partners and resources to facilitate feedback and communication, especially for those high risk and hard to place residents. A recent meeting with our discharge planners across the state made one thing abundantly clear. There is a wealth of information among our staff that is not being used to its full potential. This will be coordinated alongside parole services as well. Identifying the current components that can be done prior to 16 months. We looked at those birth certificates, social security cards, purposeful education and employment plans, and career readiness work skill development. There will always be components that need to be completed or can only be completed closer to release. transportation plans, program history and progress reports, to name a couple. We are currently restricted to 6 months or 180 days with replacement Social Security cards. These don't expire and could, in theory, be obtained at intake. I'll speak to this further in challenges.
I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up your testimony because we need to have time for questions.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Building on the success of our driver's license and ID, which is a key component of House Bill 2522, we did start this initiative in 2019 with the applications being sent through the mail. Today, we actually conduct driver's license and ID clinics in partnership with the Kansas Department of Revenue inside our facilities. I would just like to take a moment to recognize our partnership with the Kansas Department of Revenue and Senator Baumgartner and their willingness to work with us to find solutions in order for our reentering citizens to walk out with their driver's license or ID in hand. There are additional challenges, and I'd be happy to address any questions related to those. So, Madam Chair, committee members, this concludes that overview, and I'm happy to address any questions at this time.
Thank you. Want to also ask, are there any other proponent conferees wishing to testify? Not seeing any, then we'll open it up for any questions. Yes, Senator Haley.
Very briefly, and thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here, Ms. Fanning, Dr. Fanning. Are there organizations, there are entities that the department works with to dovetail once the release is in place that are community-based? I'm in Wyandotte County. I know of one or two, but how seamless is that with what you have outlined here with that? And what can we do to strengthen some of those partnerships to have those private entities that also do reentry or that work with reintegration as well? Very briefly, please, ma'am.
Madam Chair, Senator, that is a great question. We do have a lot of those resources at hand. We have individuals in the facility through our case management team and our release planners, as well as parole, that work together with those community partners. We are always looking for ways to increase and expand on those partnerships. It depends on who we're working with in the community and how well we can coordinate those resources. But I do believe that we do a wonderful job when we have those relationships established.
Thank you. I'll get your information. We'll confer later on. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Dr. Fanning, for your good work. Quick question again about the literacy. So it indicates here that within 9 months prior to a release, and part of it is the vocational training records. So that would be what they receive while they're incarcerated. Also, educational certifications. But at any point in time on entry, knowing that 14% are going to be there for at least 2 years, 19 for at least 5 years, and 29 for more than 5 years. So at what point do you determine if they actually graduated from high school with a diploma or have the GED?
Madam Chair, Senator, thank you for that question. That is actually determined at intake through work with a counselor at intake. We also have multiple college and adult education providers that are partnered with us, that when we identify a person who may have some educational needs, we are able to have that service partner administer the test of adult basic education or the TABE in order to determine their academic standing and what programming might be most appropriate for them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I noticed that the expense, for instance, getting a certified copy of a birth certificate, that's to be borne by the inmate.
Madam Chair, that is my understanding, that these expenses will continue to be the responsibility of the resident in our custody.
And sometimes the birth certificate might not be a Kansas birth certificate. So do you then have the inmate fill out the form to request the birth certificate, him or herself?
Madam Chair, thank you for that question. I do not know the full process, but yes, we do make all efforts to help a resident obtain any out-of-state birth certificates. I have a registration coordinator that works on that.
And right now, and I do want to appreciate the Department of Corrections as well as the Department of Revenue's efforts to get these inmates reintegrated into society as best as possible. The bill requires that the secretary shall make reasonable effort to provide the inmate with a social security card. And do we have inmates who are not eligible for social security cards?
Madam Chair, that's a great question. I can't answer directly that they may not be eligible. However, we do have a restriction with a memorandum of understanding with the Social Security Administration that limits us to assisting a person to getting their replacement Social Security card 6 months prior to release. So that's the limitation that we have. We definitely make all efforts to help a person obtain that documentation.
And so
when
the
we can.
secretary is okay of being in the position of determining who is eligible for a social security card and who isn't.
Madam Chair, I don't think I'm at liberty to answer that question appropriately for you, but I definitely get more information for you as you needed.
Thank you. And do we have a definition of vocational training?
The standard, Madam Chair, thank you for that question. The standard definition is any sort of skills-based training that lead to employment. Here in the state of Kansas, we often refer to it as career and technical education, or CTE, which is some sort of skills-based certification where a person can obtain a job in an industry with that industry recognized certificate.
And a follow-up question about the GED question. Then, so the secretary and the department then go back to determine high school diploma status, GED status, and the department would then do the research to determine, did this person graduate from this high school that might be in another state? And then the Kansas Department of Corrections is going to work with the other Department of Education in another state to obtain the educational certificates or diplomas in that other state as well, correct?
Madam Chair, that is correct.
And if there's an expense involved with that, the inmate would pay the expense, or we don't know. The bill doesn't really say.
Madam Chair, as of now, the resident does pay that expense.
Okay, because right now the bill says the secretary shall coordinate with state agencies to obtain the documentation. And then a resume. So the 3 FTEs that are proposed, one of those would be someone trained and skilled in computers and drafting resumes with the inmates.
Madam Chair, we currently have at every facility a career navigator, and their primary responsibility is working with individuals returning to the community to create that resume.
Okay, and so then just a few more would be needed, because I think in the fiscal note, it's estimated that there would be about 4,300 inmates that would be impacted in fiscal year 2025, and then 4,700 in fiscal year 2026. So the 3 additional would be to cover that whole population?
Madam Chair, to clarify, those 3 positions are to ensure that we can expand on those driver's license and ID clinics in order to make all reasonable efforts to have people walk out with proper identification.
So then what about these other building the resume and going back and getting diplomas and certified copies of birth certificate? Are there more FTEs needed for that?
Madam Chair, not at this time. We have individuals in place that do currently provide those services.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the broad and in-depth information about the services that the department provides currently, and then what they would do if the bill were to be enacted. Are there other questions? Senator Steffen.
Thank you. Let's review where we ended up there on the fiscal note. I've seen 2 or 3 different calculations in the paperwork I have, and I didn't catch that whole conversation. So 30 seconds spent on that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah. Madam Chair, Senator, the fiscal note, the most recent one, has 3 FTEs. That is in order to increase our capacity to be able to continue to go out to facilities to provide driver's license and ID clinics. Currently, we have one individual who coordinates that around the state. And if we were to expand these efforts to everybody, we would need those additional FTEs.
Thank you. Committee, other questions? Not seeing any, then thank you very much for your testimony here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Are there any persons wishing to testify as neutral or opponent to the bill? Not seeing any, then we will close the hearing on House Bill 2522. And committee, want to quickly direct your attention to a review of the meeting minutes from February. These meeting minutes are in your committee documents at your desk. February 12, 13, 14, 15, 19, and 20. If you'll take just a minute to review those if you haven't already, and I would entertain a motion or other discussion. Senator Wilborn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did review the minutes, and I can't completely ascertain their accuracy. They look good, and I make a move that we approve them.
And a second from Senator Gossage. You all have heard the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion carries. Thank you, committee, for your work today, for staff, and for those who testified today, and those following along online or in the committee meeting room. And with that, the committee is adjourned.